It's 1925. The Great War has recently ended, and Japan's economy is in a slump after a post-war boom. Thousands of Japanese families seek out a new life from outside the widespread poverty of the rural Japanese countryside and venture outside traditional regions for Japanese settlers. On the other side of the world, a Japanese coffee farmer heads home to his family. Only this isn't the United States or anywhere else in North America, but rather a bit south of that. Or maybe much more south, in the South American country of Brazil. Today we're going to talk about the hidden Japanese minority of South America who've had a long and extensive history and influence in these countries, most notably Peru, where the Japanese occupy a very prominent socio-economic position, and Brazil, which actually has the largest Japanese population on Earth outside of their home country of Japan. During the height of Japanese immigration to Brazil, on average over 50 Japanese immigrants were arriving in the country every single day, which may not sound like a lot, but that concluded to almost 20,000 a year in the early 1930s. But why would the Japanese choose to move to a hot and humid climate like South America anyways? As many people know, the first major region of permanent Japanese settlement outside of the home islands was on the archipelago of Hawaii, even before the kingdom was annexed by the United States in 1898, with tens of thousands of Japanese migrating to the islands in the mid to late 1800s and extended to the mainland of the United States, almost exclusively the west coast around the same time period. The Japanese followed in the footsteps of already well-established large Chinese communities in states like California, Nevada, Idaho, and Washington, mostly working as unskilled laborers such as farmers or gold miners. Because of fears of mass immigration to the West Coast from Asia, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, effectively halting Asian immigration to the mainland United States, although a handful of Japanese professionals and students were still allowed into the U.S. through the unofficial Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. Japanese migration to the States was ultimately completely halted by the Immigration Act of 1924 and the economic recessions of the late 20s, but especially in the 30s in Japan caused a huge wave of poor Japanese farmers to seek out a better life for themselves outside of Japan. Japan and Portugal, Brazil's colonial predecessor, have had a very old relationship spanning almost 500 years, with the Portuguese being some of the first Europeans to have arrived in the far east of the Asian continent, and thus a handful of Japanese who were of the Catholic faith and had a rudimentary knowledge of the Portuguese language even as early as the 1600s. Brazil was chosen as a new destination for Japanese immigrants mostly because of its demand for unskilled labor and major shortages on coffee plantations following the drop-off in Italian immigration, with the Japanese government heavily encouraging rural peasants to head to South America, although working conditions were anything but ideal. Although Japan did already have a small Catholic community with Portuguese links, the majority of Japanese that migrated to Brazil were not Christian, mostly practicing Buddhism or Shintoism, and thus were generally segregated, often voluntarily, from the rest of the Brazilian population of European, African, Native American, and multiracial descent. Although it would seem counterproductive with the Pacific Ocean being a straight shot from Japan on one side to South America on the other, oftentimes ships carrying Japanese passengers would instead go the opposite direction, passing through the East Indies, the Indian Ocean, and around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa for many reasons, mostly to restock at local ports around the Indian Ocean, and because the Pacific was known even then to have some of the worst tropical storms of any ocean on Earth. And it's important to realize that oftentimes this voyage could take up to 2 months at sea, although this is a bit of a different story for Peru, which has a Pacific Ocean coast. The Japanese were initially mostly rural, working on coffee plantations and locally owned farms, although some did rise up on the totem pole, able to eventually buy their own land and become Brazilian citizens, and although occasionally discriminated against, were respected to at least a small degree by the native-born population for their strong work ethic. Japanese immigration started to decline after the boom of the late 20s and early 30s and completely dried up during World War II when Brazil, along with most other Latin American countries, declared war on Japan and the other Axis powers, and their Japanese population was seen as a bit of a fifth column for the potential future invasion and colonization by Japan, as the Imperial Japanese government had plans to conquer most, if not all, of South America. Similar to the Japanese and German populations of the United States, the Japanese faced harsh discrimination in all of Latin America during World War II, with many being sent to internment camps or were deported from the country, and the Japanese were forbidden from speaking the Japanese language in public. Japanese immigration picked up after the war, reaching another peak in the 1950s and 60s before quickly petering out by the 1970s, with most Japanese being concentrated in Sao Paulo and other southern states. There are also around 250,000 and 50,000 ethnic Chinese and Koreans in Brazil, respectively, who significantly add to the Asian Brazilian population. However, for obvious reasons, they have a very distinct background and culture from Japanese Brazilians, who currently number around 1.6 to 1.8 million people. According to the official Brazilian census, as of 2010, around 2% of the city of Sao Paulo is of Asian descent, although this number is likely an undercount and it could be closer to 3 to 5% of the city, making it the largest percentage in the entire country. Although Japanese and other Asian Brazilians have historically been concentrated in the southern region, in recent years many have moved to other parts of the country that have not had any Japanese community at all, such as in the northeast or in the interior. For a snapshot on the Japanese Brazilian community currently, a little less than half are fluent in the Japanese language, and this number is falling quickly as most second and third generation Japanese Brazilians speak only Portuguese. They are a very religiously diverse group, with around 52% practicing Catholicism, 9% Protestantism, 22% Buddhism, 8% Shintoism, and around 9% are irreligious, which is in stark contrast to the actual country of Japan, which has a much smaller Christian percentage. As mentioned previously, Peru also has a rather large Japanese population of nearly 160,000 people, which is only around 0.5% of Peru's population. However, the Japanese have proven to be one of the country's most affluent and influential ethnic minorities. Japanese immigrants, mainly from Okinawa, settled in Lima to also work on coffee plantations. However, many did not bring their families with them, and thus it was common for Japanese men to marry Peruvian women of various races. Alberto Fujimori, born in Lima in 1938, is most likely the most well-known member of the Japanese-Peruvian community, having served as president of Peru between 1990 and 2000. And his legacy is looked upon with mixed feelings by many Peruvians, and his children are also quite active in Peruvian politics even to this day. Notably Kenji Fujimori, a congressman from Lima, and Keiko Fujimori, who actually ran for president of Peru twice, both in 2011 and 2016, and actually almost won, losing an incredibly slim race by 0.2%, despite her father and former President Alberto still serving a 25-year sentence in prison for human rights abuses. Out of the top 10 countries with the highest overseas Japanese population, believe it or not, 3 are in South America, although admittedly Japan doesn't have a relatively large diaspora when compared to the population of its home nation, with only around 4 million Japanese living outside of Japan when compared to the 7 million ethnic Koreans outside of Korea or 70 million Han Chinese outside of the PRC. There are also nearly 100,000 ethnic Japanese in other parts of Latin America, mostly in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and their communities are more or less linked with their much larger communities of Brazil and Peru. The Japanese population of South America has been on the decline in recent years, having a very low birth rate mirroring that of their home country, and the average age of a Japanese Brazilian is around 38 years old when compared to 32 for Brazil as a whole and 47 for Japan. Although it was very rare for first-generation immigrants to marry a non-Japanese spouse, there's also been a huge amount of mixing with other races in Brazil, including every single racial category from blacks to whites. Around 20 to 30% of self-identified Japanese Brazilians in Brazil today have ancestry from another racial group, meaning that less than 80% are of pure Japanese ancestry, and today around half of all marriages involving a Japanese spouse involve another spouse of non-Japanese origin, leading to many of half or quarter Japanese descent not learning the language and having little to no ties with the homeland or culture. The third and most substantial factor in the decline of the number of Japanese in South America is the huge rate of emigration back to Japan. Although keep in mind it isn't exactly a reverse migration, as the majority of Brazilian citizens in Japan, even those of Japanese descent, have been well established in Brazil for generations and mostly speak Portuguese. Many Japanese of Brazilian, Peruvian, or other Latin American nationality, known as Dekasegi, have been migrating to Japan or the United States since the 1980s, with Japan alone having around 500,000 Latin American immigrants of Japanese ancestry and their descendants, although even they too are often seen as outsiders or foreigners in Japanese culture because of differences in language, religion, and culture, and this has led to Japan having the largest Portuguese-speaking population in all of Asia. The largest number and proportion of Brazilians in Japan is in Nagoya, where those born in Latin America and their descendants make up around 1% of the population, although it's currently unknown what percentage of Latin American-born migrants in Japan are of Japanese origin and how many have other racial origins. Even if South America's once bustling Japanese community does fizzle out, their legacy in these Latin American countries will live on, and although their history is one of struggle and pain, it also gives hope and pride to many Japanese Latin Americans around today. Please let me know your thoughts on the Japanese communities of Brazil, Peru, and others in Latin America. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.